Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our Hutchinson Public Library Meet the Author event featuring the book My Life in Baseball. My Life in Baseball is a memoir of the first 5 years of former Minnesota Twins athletic trainer Jim Kahmann, right there in the middle. Yes, please welcome him. And his wife Michelle, all the way from Florida. So this book talks about his career, which took him from Mankato State University to Florida and Venezuela in the 1980s. Today we're thrilled to welcome Jim and his brother and publisher Andy and his sister Patsy, and then Philip is way over here hiding. But we got a third of the family, I was told, a third of the family with us today. We're thrilled. Following today's event, Jim will be available to sign books, and copies of the books will also be available for sale. And I should also mention that the bookstore in town also has copies of the book as well. So, funding for today's author event is made possible thanks to the Friends of the Hutchinson Public Library. There's Cindy and Carolyn and Mary and Jean. So I just want to shout out to them. We'd also, yes, thank you. Please give them a round of hand. They do tremendous work for our library. We'd also like to thank HCVN for filming today's event. If you don't know anyone who couldn't be here today, tell them to go on to HCVN, the YouTube channel. They've got it, and they'll also air on TV as well. And Val Elder is behind the camera, giving me the thumbs up. So, huge shout out to her. She always helps us out. Now, on to the main event. Please give a warm welcome to Jim Kahmann.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Such a great crowd. I'm really excited about this. When I started the journey and we had the book published, I knew I wanted to come to Minnesota. And so I told my sister Patsy I want to piggyback on her best places that she went to. And so she said, right away, she said Hutchinson. And she had such a great turnout. And I said, okay, let's go to Hutchinson. So I'm going to turn I'm going to turn the microphone over to my brother Andy, and he's going to start the ceremony.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Thanks for coming, and thanks to Katie and the Friends of the Library for helping support this and hosting this event. I started working at the Bird Island Union when I was 15 years old, and when Art Naker and Joan Naker kind of took me under their wing and gave me the opportunity to learn a trade. And so I've been in some sort of printing for 57 years because I really fell in love with putting a blank piece of paper in the press and putting on the impression and having a printed page come out. So I've always done printing, some sort of printing, and for the past 24 years I've had a old-fashioned letterpress print shop in Montevideo where I've worked with artists and poets because I can't draw, so I had to have something for images. And so that's kind of how it started. And about 10 years ago, a friend of mine, Lucy Tokine, brought me a little card, kind of a book that was given to her. And it's so simple. It's printed on one side of the paper, and then it's folded and cut, and it ends up being a little book. So I started doing these little books. And we have Patsy's, chapter of Patsy's book, and also a chapter of Jim's book. And they're available, they're free for everybody to have one. You can take one, or one of each one. But the simplicity of it is what I started a book project of what I do. I have over 75 people signed up. I've done 37 of them. 9 of those were done letterpress. And the first one that I did letterpress was Patsy's book, because about 3 years ago I had some health issues, and Patsy started a text chain with our family and kind of reconnected everybody. And Patsy helped set and organize that. And then she went to all of my treatments for the next 6 months. And during that time, she keeps talking about her book that she started writing 20 years ago. And as we were talking, and sometimes everybody would get chapters, some of us would not pay attention to them because we didn't want to go back there and think about it. And she would ask questions, do you remember this, do you remember that? And we were just kind of vague. So that 20 years to write the book. Actually turned into 30, and then almost into 40. And so we did this little book, and I thought that would help and be enough for her to stop talking about she's got to get her book published. She's got to get her book published. But it made it worse. And so one night I woke up and I thought, well, you know, I worked with a poet who did a book, and she self-published. So I waited until a decent hour, and I called Patsy and I said, why don't we just self-publish it? And the first thing out of her mouth was, I don't have money for that. And I replied, I don't either. But we can start looking into what it might cost because I have some connections. And so we started looking, and a couple of weeks later, 3 unnamed brothers sent enough money for the first printing. That's kind of how it began. And so I'll let Patsy take over from here, but feel free to pick these up, or Phil might pass them out. They're free to take. They're a unique little book that I like doing. If anybody's interested, I have information that they can do their own little book. Okay?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, that first chapter that he printed that we together did on his letterpress took 3 or 4 days of 8 and 10-hour days. And I learned from that to cut down, because the old way of doing letterpress, you had to set every single letter and space by hand. And it's not like now where you can make changes real easily. And I thought every writer should have to set something by letterpress, because they'll learn to get rid of the excess that doesn't belong. Anyway, I was thrilled that Andy and my brothers were willing to help me get on this journey. And many of you came to my reading here in Hutchinson and other places. I'm proud to say that in the past 1.5 years, we just went back to do another print run. We've sold almost 700, which is really pretty good for a small independent publisher. And the New York Kirkus Reviews magazine featured my book as one of 40 indie, how did they title it? One of 40 indie books worth discovering. So that was another thrill. Anyway, I wanted to talk about my brother Jim. But first, I want to say that both of these brothers are lucky to have made it out of childhood. They each had a major trauma to their body that could have ended their lives. Andy's had to do with his hand, and if you read my book, you already know. If you
I've read the book.
Okay, if you haven't read
That's the hand.
yeah,
It's still there.
if you haven't read the book, buy it, or we'll tell you the story later. Jim he's how much younger? Well, I'm the second oldest of 12. Jim is, you're 12. Yeah, me. I know, but of him. Yeah, 10. Okay. Anyway, Andy's number 4 in the family. Jim is the second youngest, and so we like to now advertise the second oldest and the second youngest in a family of 12 are authors. And I want to acknowledge my brother Philip, who is the bronze and the brain behind all this, and we couldn't do it without him. He helps out so much. And
I just show up for a free meal.
yeah. But when Andy was like 10 months old, we had Jim, whatever your name is. Mom and Dad went through this. Carl, Patsy, whatever your name is. Get to the table. Jim was only, we called him Jimmy then. He was about 10 months old. We had just moved from Missouri to Granite Falls. My dad was a traveling salesman, and he got transferred to the southwestern area of Minnesota. And we lived on in a rented farmhouse in Granite Falls. And a Saturday morning, it was bitterly cold, and it was nothing like, we had not experienced that cold before. So we didn't go outside when it was that cold, and we were getting ready for lunch, and Mom was getting cranky because 12 kids under 14 was getting on her nerves. And so she told Dad, send them all into we did have a big living room, and she told them all to go in there, and, we were playing some game that we had made up. And I was trying to remember the name of it. It involved a lot of roughhousing. But I thought we discovered tag football, touch football, or flag football until we saw the Kennedys do it on TV. So we thought they stole our game. So maybe we weren't as creative as we thought. But anyway, everybody's playing around. All of a sudden, Dad just screams, Jimmy, and he runs to the middle of the room, picks up. Jimmy had been trying to breathe, and all of a sudden he went limp and started turning blue. And this is before we knew about the Heimlich maneuver. And so back then, you just hit somebody on the back, and Dad was hitting him, 10-month-old baby, hitting him. He still wasn't breathing, and all of a sudden, he just started to breathe again. But his breathing was more like a wheeze, but he was breathing. So later that afternoon, Mom and Dad thought we should take him in to the hospital because he just wasn't himself. So we go in, I went with them, and the nurse and the doctor, they were kind of condescending to Mom. And they didn't know us because we were new to the area. They didn't realize she was the mother of 12 kids. So they're trying to say, well, he obviously just has croup. Croup is going around. So you don't really need anything else but some cough syrup. And Mom was really mad that she knew it was different than just, and she said, this morning he was fine. He seemed to have choked on something, and now he's not breathing as well. And they were like, well, that's how croup is. She wasn't very happy. But we went home, and through the week, Jim got worse and worse. He would only drink from his bottle. And it was over a week. This one night, I just picked him up out of his crib and took him into my bed, propped him up with pillows because I just had this premonition he was dying because he just was not breathing well. And so about 5 o'clock in the morning, I just carried him into Mom and Dad's room and I said, Jimmy's dying. And they got up, and it's not like they didn't realize how sick he was. They had actually taken him back to the doctor and still got sent home with more cough syrup. So they took him into the hospital in Granite Falls, and they decided to rush him to the hospital. Well, he was in an ambulance, and it was just out of town that the ambulance driver realized he wasn't going to last till Minneapolis. So they took him to Wilmer. And there was a new Chinese doctor there, Dr. Lee, and he took him right in for an x-ray. And the rest of the other earlier, they'd never taken an x-ray, though Mom kept saying, why can you x-ray his throat? Anyway, they took him in for an x-ray, and the doctor comes out and says, does he have one of those chains around his neck, like with a cross? Mom said no, and he said, well, there's something inside his throat. And they did this new experiment, this new surgery at the time. Instead of having to cut, they went down his throat, and it was actually in his windpipe. Did you remember those ballpoint pens that, they had a metal thing in this
silver metal piece?
And we would, take them apart, and in a large family, there were things on the floor, and Jim must have picked one up, put it in his mouth, and they figured that when he first was choking, that it was lodged sideways. And when Dad hit him on the back, it lodged where he could actually breathe. But over the course of the week, the milk that he was drinking was collecting on there and curdling. And by the time they got it out, there was just this thin little sliver of air, which, anyway, they saved his life. And within an hour, he was running around like a toddler should. And he came home, and the only lingering thing was his voice changed. And here's this little kid going around, "Hi, I'm Jim. My name is Jim." And so Dad nicknamed him Big Jim. So from then on, we called him Big Jim. Now I think he's had other names since then, but Big Jim is this is my brother. And so I'm proud to have been part of his journey. Getting my book published spurred him on, and I'll let him. This is the reason you came, is to hear him. He's got a lot of stories. He's really the storyteller of the family.
Thank you, Patsy. The voice that I have now is the same voice I had when I was 6 and 7 years old, okay? When I went through puberty, my voice didn't change. It was always this voice. So people, when I would call them, would know exactly who I was when they answered the phone. So I spent 20 years in professional baseball, 11 years in the minor leagues, 9 years in the major leagues. So a lot of things happen in baseball that people don't see because of the game is going on. That happens, you know, in the dugout, it may happen in the clubhouse, it may happen in a hotel, it may happen in a bar, it may happen on the street. So I have a plethora of stories, and I would tell all these stories. People would say something about a city, and I've been to a lot of cities across the country, and I would have a story of that city. Or something happened, I would have a story for it. And people would always say, "Jim, you should write a book." And I was like, who wants to read a book about an athletic trainer? I said, you may want to read a book about Kirby Puckett or Paul Molitor or any other major name Minnesota Twin. And so I didn't want to write a book. I didn't set out to write a book. But I retired about 3 years ago, maybe 4. And I had a lot of free time. I played golf 3 days a week. And then 4 days a week, I had a lot of free time. So I said, let's see if I can put these stories on paper. The first 2 chapters in the book took me 4 months to write. Okay, I'm not a writer, and it's very difficult to get from my brain the story I want to tell on paper. And in the way that you can understand it a little bit like me telling the story. So it took me a long time to write those first 2 chapters. I have to thank my wife, Michelle. She's been my editor. She would edit my stories because I use the word "that" a lot, and I would have the same word twice in a sentence, and I didn't realize it. So Michelle would edit it. I would make the corrections. I would send the stories to Patsy. She would edit them, and then I would send those chapters out. So the first 2 chapters I sent out to all my brothers and sisters, and probably to 50 close friends that knew I worked in baseball, and I knew they might like these stories. Immediately I got a response. I want more. I want more of this. This is beautiful. This is great. I love your writing. So that made me feel very confident. So I said, well, why don't I start from the beginning and start from the first season. So that's what I did. My first season was in Utica, New York. It was a half season. And then the next year was West Palm, and then 2 years in Jacksonville. And then I went to Winter Ball in Venezuela. Most people don't know anything about Venezuela except what you've seen recently in the news. This is 1988. I went down to Venezuela. It was a democratic country at the time. And they were having a presidential election that year. And in one city, Maracaibo, both presidential candidates were at the stadium the same day. And they both came into the locker room, and I shook hands. They were shaking hands with everybody, so I eventually shook hands with the eventual president of Venezuela. I don't know who I shook hands with or who won or whatever, but I eventually shook his hand. But it took me a long time to write about Venezuela because I had to break it up a little bit. The culture, the language, everyday living. In Venezuela, everybody takes a siesta from 11 to 2. Everybody except restaurants closes the doors. Banks, malls, everybody. Everybody goes home for 3 hours, and then they come back at 2, and then they work till 8. So, I had to explain all of that stuff. Well, it took me about a year. When I was done writing about Venezuela, I said, well, this is a good time to take a break. I was tired of writing. It was almost 3 years of writing. And as Patsy will know and tell you, writing is difficult. It's not easy, okay? It's great to tell a story, and I could stand here and tell you all those stories, but to put them down on paper is hard. It's tough. And I was tired of writing. So I said, I'm done writing. I don't know how long I'm going to take a break. Don't know how long it's going to be. I don't know if I'm going to write anymore. So that was in November, December. Michelle and I came up here to do Billy Neibauer's Tim Orth Foundation 30th anniversary last year in March. This year, yes, March of this year, I'm sorry. My brother Andy had taken all my stories, because I did it in chronological order. He had taken all those stories, put them together, and made 4 books for us. He made a book for Andy, he made a book for Patsy, one for Michelle, and one for myself. And he goes, you're a writer. And I go, boy, that was pretty emotional. I said it felt like Christmas and my birthday all in one. To see all those stories and to see them in a book was pretty special. So I said, if we're going to do this, I need to write another season. Because I've been sending these chapters to 60 people. I want those 60 people to buy a book. So I said, okay, well, let me write about one more season, so that I have a hook to get those 60 people to buy the book. So I wrote about my first season in the minor leagues working for the Minnesota Twins. The first 4 years I worked for the Montreal Expos. So I thought this would be a good, most of my friends are from Minnesota, they understood, they knew I worked for the Twins. And so I wrote another season. I found a bunch of pictures. My family added some pictures, so there's some really great pictures in the book. And so about 6 months ago we were done with everything, and then we had to go to the printer and the publisher to go through everything. I had to change a couple names because people got arrested, okay? And so I always say I changed the names to protect the innocent, and my wife says you changed the names to protect the guilty. So we did that, and literally the book was finished and printed just over 2 months ago, and it's been a whirlwind. And I said, okay, well, a lot of my audience is in Minnesota because I grew up here, I went to college here, I worked for the Twins, so I knew a lot of people were here. And so I said, I want to do a mini book tour. And I asked Patsy, I said this before, because we started in Bird Island, I said, well, let's go to 3 of your best places. And she goes, well, the first one is Hutchinson. We got to go to Hutchinson. And I said, okay. And so Patsy talked to Katie, and Katie was more than excited to know that I wrote a book. And she said, oh, absolutely, we're going to have them here. And so that's how I got here to Hutchinson. And I'm really excited. So like Patsy did for hers, she read a chapter of her book and then took questions and stuff like that. So I'm not going to read a chapter in my book. I'm going to tell you a chapter in my book because I'm a storyteller. And if I start reading it, I'm going to miss words and I'm going to stop and I'm going to forget something. So I'm just going to tell you the story of the chapter. So really it's chapter 2 in the book. I am sitting on one of those big blue cushion tarps that you see high jumpers and pole vaulters fall into. And I'm sitting on that. I'm in the field house at West Point Military Academy. I went there to do a basketball camp right after I graduated from college in 1985. And so it's the 3rd week of this camp. And this was before they had AAU camps or Nike camps or all these big camps that all these kids go to nowadays. But it was the best high school basketball players out of New York City, both boys and girls. So each week was a different. 1 week was girls, and then 2 weeks for the boys. So this was the last week, and so there's 200 kids running around these basketball courts at this field house. Well, this payphone starts to ring, and this was before cell phones, but there were payphones all over West Point Military Academy, and this phone kept ringing. I thought somebody else was going to pick it up. I was enjoying resting on the big blue tarp, but the phone kept ringing. So I said, well, somebody better go pick that up. So I decided I go, and literally this is about 3 or 4 minutes that this phone is ringing. So I go up, I pick up the phone, and the guy goes, I'm looking for Jim Kahmann. I recognize the voice on the other end. The voice on the other end is Gordy Graham, who was the head athletic trainer at Mankato State, where I just graduated from. And I said, Gordy, what are you doing? He goes, Jimmy, do you know how many payphones I've been calling in the last hour trying to find you? And I was like, well, no. He goes, in the Utica Blue Sox minor league team just fired their athletic trainer. The third base coach went to Mankato State as a baseball player and worked in the and played in the minor leagues for the Expos, and then became a coach that year. And at that time, there were 3 other Mankato State graduates that were working in the minor leagues for the Montreal Expos. So I knew those other athletic trainers. And so I said, Gordy goes, here's the number to the owner in Utica. Talk to him, find out. So I called him. He goes, I'll offer you $1,000 for 6 weeks. I'll pay you for your train ride up to Utica and then a plane ride home. And I said, okay, you got a deal. So Friday afternoon, after the basketball camp was over, I got on a train, got off at Utica, and when you get off the train, there's not like at the airport here, where they have that sign and it would say Jim Kahmann or some high dignitary. There was nobody there to greet me. Except I got out on the street and a guy taps me on the shoulder and I look over and it's a guy about my age in jeans and a t-shirt, and he goes, it's 2 o'clock. No. He goes, are you the new athletic trainer for the Utica Blue Sox? And I said, yeah. He goes, I'm supposed to pick you up. I had 2 suitcases, and he goes, my car's right over here. And his car was like a 1970 Chevrolet Impala. And when I got into the car, there was so much dust in the car, and I'm in my only and best suit, and I'm thinking, how much of this dust is going to get on this suit? So I get to the ballpark, I meet a couple of the players, and all of a sudden they said, Jim, you're wanted on the field. So I go down on the field, and the manager of the Utica Blue Sox was an ex-pitcher named Ken Brett, whose younger brother and more famous brother was George Brett of the Kansas City Royals. So I knew the name. I got introduced to him. Gene Glenn, the third base coach, was there. He remembered me from college. And so Ken goes, hey Jim, this player has a boil on his leg. Can you lance it? That's exactly what I did. I went, I don't think so. My education tells me not to do that. I didn't say that. I just said, No, I said, only a doctor can lance a boil. And the guy's like, no, 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 just lance it, because, we got to get the game. And I said, no, 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 I've got to see him. I got to take him to the doctor. And luckily, the closest hospital was literally across the street from the ballpark. So I went into the front office, met the owner, and I said, I got to take this guy to the ER. I got to get him treated. So he gave me the information to where to send the bills and everything. We walk across the street in uniform, his uniform, to the ER, helped us. We got to the front of the line. The doctor comes in to examine him. Well, the player had not only had one boil, he had 4 boils on his body. And so the doctor goes, we're going to put him on a lot of medication. We're going to keep him overnight and try to, get control of these boils. And then I said, Doc, can I ask you a question? I said, is there any way you would have lanced these boils? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He goes, we would never do that. He goes, if you lance that, that's just poison. And anybody that's standing within 20 feet can get infected. And then they're going to get boils. So that's not how we treat it. I said, I just wanted to make sure I was thinking the right way. So I go back to the ballpark, left the player in good care, and I change. I was still in my suit, so I change. I go down in the field, and I meet Ken and Gene to give them the bad news. And I said, well, the player, and they're like, well, where's the player? And I said, well, he's still in the hospital. He's got to stay overnight because he's got 4 boils, and we got to treat it. And Ken Brett was really upset. He goes, that's our starting center fielder. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know that. So he was a little upset with me. So I go to the other end of the dugout, and a couple innings later, he comes over to me and he goes, Jimmy, I just want to say, thank you. I know you're doing what's best for the player, and I appreciate that. And, Gino tells me that you like to drink a lot of beer. Because we went to college together. So I said, yeah. And he goes, what kind of beer do you like to drink? And I said, I'm a Bud guy. I said, I like Budweiser. And he turns, he looks at me, and he goes, what kind of beer do you drink? And I'm thinking, okay, this is Ken Brett. He's a major league player. I'm going to go to the expensive side of Budweiser. And I said, I drink Michelob. And he grabs me by the shirt, and he sticks me up against the wall. And he goes, I'm going to give you 5 seconds. I'm going to let go of your shirt, and I want you to look at the scoreboard, and I want you to tell me what kind of free beer you like to drink. So he let go. I looked at the scoreboard, and it was one of these huge Miller Lite scoreboards. So I said Miller Lite. And so all the players were around, and they were in on the joke. Well, the joke was that when I was at West Point for those 3 weeks, we had no TV. There was no TV at West Point. There was no radio. They only broadcast reveille at 6 o'clock in the morning to wake you up so that you could get to the mess hall. So there was a commercial. If some of you remember the old Miller Lite commercials with Deacon Jones and who was the football coach? John Madden. They would go, less filling, tastes great. Less filling, tastes great. And then they would come through the sign and they would be yelling that for the Miller Lite. So that was a big Miller Lite start of that. Well, they had Ken Brett do a commercial. So the commercial starts, he wakes up, he had just woken up at the end of the bar, okay? He wakes up, and there's 3 old guys standing there at the bar, and he goes, am I in New York City? And the 3 guys go, nope. And then Ken goes, am I in Chicago? And they go, no. He goes, am I in St. Louis? They go, no. And he goes, where am I? And they all go, Utica. And he goes, Utica? And that was the end of the commercial. Because they paid Ken in beer. So, in fact, there would be times during the rest of the 6 weeks that I was there that Ken would go, hey, Jimmy, go up the Miller Lite business card, call them, just tell them I need some beer. And I would call them, and within an hour, there was a big beer truck dropping off cases of beer. So after the game, Gene Glenn picks me up. He says, well, let's go. We're going to have dinner after the game. This is like, by now, it's like 11 o'clock at night. He goes, and then I'll take you to where you're going to be staying. So I said, okay. So we had a couple beers and some dinner. And so he pulls up to the college, the Utica College, and he hands me 2 keys. One key is for the front door, and one key is for a dorm room. I'm the only one there because it was just summer. The school, the dormitory was empty. So this is where I was supposed to live. So I get in, I start unpacking like I'm a college student going to college for the first day, and I'm going, this is professional baseball, this is what I want to do, and I went, Utica? So that was my first day in professional baseball. So that was always a good starting point for things. So I don't want to bore you with any more, but I could tell you another story that you might like to hear. So I'm going to tell one more story, and then I'll take questions. Later that season, towards the very end of the season, minor league season always ended on Labor Day, which was the first Monday in September. So that year, Labor Day was on the 3rd or 4th of September. Well, some of these players, by that time I had moved in with 2 players in a house that was next to a bar that was next to the stadium. And the guy that owned the bar owned the house, so that was my landlord. So there was 2 other guys. We lived in this really nice house. It was furnished. So 2 players were going to be kicked out of their apartment on the 31st. They had nowhere else to go. We didn't get paid a whole lot of money. So they said, hey, can we live on your couch for 2 nights? We only had 2 more games to play. I said, okay, you can stay on our couch. So that Friday night, well, Saturday morning, I wake up, I go downstairs to make breakfast, and the 2 players are sleeping on the couch, and I said to the one, I said, Mark, I said, I had a really strange dream last night. I dreamt that you tried to wake me up in the middle of the night and that you broke your hand in a fight. And all I see over the end of the couch is this hand go up, and his hand is all swollen. And he goes, Jimmy, we tried to wake you up, but you wouldn't wake up. And he goes to proceed to tell me that he got into a fight. And the fight was really, this Mark Meyer was only 18 at the time. He was 6'5", weighed 250 pounds. He was a man-child. He was a huge individual.
And Mark Meyer is a pseudonym.
And Mark Meyer is a pseudonym. I can't tell you the real name. Mark Meyer was my best friend from high school. The other player was Larry Walker, who eventually became a Hall of Fame player. And he was my roommate for the next 2 out of the 3 years. Anyways, these 2 guys had started dating these 2 girls from Utica. They were in a bar. Some of the local guys in Utica didn't like the local girls dating, the athletes in town that weren't going to stay around. So there were some words said in the bar closes, they all get in their car, they pull up to the first stoplight, these guys come up next to them, all of a sudden a beer bottle comes flying out, crashes on the window of the girl's car, breaks her window. Mark Meyer actually breaks the seat. They were in a 2-door car. He actually broke the driver's seat getting out of the car because he was upset. So he gets out, opens the passenger side of the truck, and starts smoking this guy. All right? The driver had gotten out, grabbed a tire iron, came running around the back of the truck, and Mark said, instincts told me somebody was there. He turned, smokes this guy, drops him on the ground. He pulls the other guy back out of the truck and starts smashing his face into the ground. And then somebody else was in another car and said, hey, you guys got to get out of here. The cops are coming. So they took off. So then they came to the house and tried to wake me up, and I wouldn't wake up, so they went to sleep. So the next morning, so now I told Mark, I said, we need to go to the emergency room and get your hand x-rayed, because you probably broke it. And he goes, no, Jimmy. He goes, I don't play. I'll just tape it up. I'll just fake what I'm doing, but I won't play. So I'll just try to get away with it. So I go to lunch. That was back in the day that towns had 2 newspapers. They had a paper in the morning, they had a paper in the afternoon. So I'm reading the afternoon paper at lunch, and it says, 2 men assaulted on Highway 7. And they go to explain, one guy's got a broken jaw, and the other guy's got 50 stitches in his face. And I'm going, huh. So I go to the ballpark, I ask Mark, I show him the newspaper, I said, is this you? And he goes, yeah, I guess that was me. And I go, okay. And he goes, well, don't worry about it. You know, this is an 18-year-old kid, you know, don't worry about it. During the game that night, 2 cops show up, and they start talking to Ken Brett, the manager, because he was famous. So it wasn't unusual for cops to start talking to us and stuff. And all of a sudden, the one cop goes, is there a guy named Mark Meyer here? And Ken Brett goes, yeah, he's sitting right there in the dugout. So the cops come on the field, they go up to Mark, and they say, Mark Meyer, you're under arrest for assault. And all stuff breaks loose, okay? The manager goes, wait a minute. The third base coach is going, hey, hang on a second. So Ken says, look, let's go up to the clubhouse and get this straightened out. Ken and Gene don't know anything about the fight. So they go up, they leave me in charge of the team. We were out in the field. The inning gets over and all the players come running off and they want to go up to the clubhouse. I said, you guys can't do that. We have to finish this game. We have 5 more innings to play. So I was the de facto manager. I don't know if we won the game or not, but after the 9th inning, everybody runs up to the clubhouse. They want to see what's going on. But by that time, the cops had taken Mark to the cop shop with Gene Glenn and Ken Brett. So I was told to stay by the phone in Ken's office. About half an hour later, the minor league director for the Montreal Expos calls me. His name was Bob Gebhardt, and he goes, Jim, they're going to release Mark Meyer in about a half an hour. As soon as they get to the ballpark, you and Gene Glenn take him to the Syracuse airport, and you get him on the first plane out of town. I don't care where it's going, just get him out of town, okay? So I run back to my house, because Mark's luggage was there. I packed his luggage up, got to the ballpark, packed his baseball gear up. By that time, here they come. So I told Gene Glenn, I said, this is what Geb wants us to do. He goes, all right, Troy, or Mark, let's go. let's go to the airport. So we drive to the Syracuse airport from Utica. Now it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. We pull up to the airport. There's a lady sitting there at the information, and I said to the lady, I said, where's your first plane out of town? She goes, where do you want to go? I said, that's not the question. The question is, where's the next flight leaving? And she goes, well, our next flight that leaves is at 4 o'clock. I said, okay. So we bought him a ticket, and we got him out of town. To this day, I can't remember where he flew to, but I knew we got him out of town. And so, that's stuff that happens, okay? And that's stuff I had to deal with. So in the book, I will explain, and I always talk about the many hats of an athletic trainer. As an athletic trainer, I went to college, and we were taught how to treat injuries, how to get players back from injuries. When you're a minor league trainer, you do so much more. And I explain that in the book, and bail bondsman was one of them, okay? So those are a couple stories. There's a lot of good stories in here. There are stories that will make you cry, and there are stories that will make you laugh. And I want my sister to read a couple of the responses that I have gotten from people that have already read the book, and it kind of justifies me writing the book.
And I after this, we'll do a Q&A, so if you've got any questions. So this is from Brad Osage from Rhode Island. I bought your book. Great read. It would be a great read even without knowing you and your connection to Rhode Island. Another one. Hey Jim, I read a book a week. Yours was as good a read as any. I thought I had a good story or two. Turns out I'm in junior high. You had a PhD. Tony Ferncase. Just finished your book. More tears than I expected. There is crying in baseball. Dr. Michael Layton. Got the book and already started reading it. I think I'm going to like it, especially like the part about you watching Hank Aaron's famous home run with your dad at a bar in Chaska. Just finished it. Love the stories about people and places I know. I had forgotten you came up through the Expos organization. J.T. Brewitt, former player for the Minnesota Twins. Jimmy, I got your book and I love reading it. Bravo. I'm loving the book. I have been laughing out loud reading it. I remember so many of the stories. I love how the book reads like a casual conversation. Dr. Diane Dom, former Minnesota Twins orthopedic surgeon.
So the quote about there's no crying in baseball, if you remember the movie League of Their Own, it's about the female baseball players that played baseball during the World War II. Tom Hanks was the manager. He was this old, drunk, used up major league player, and they asked him to be a manager for one of the teams, and he was a rough kind of guy, treated the girls like they were men, and so he was berating one of the girls, and she started to cry. And Tom Hanks goes, "Are you crying?" And she goes, "No." And he goes, "Are you crying?" "No." And he goes, "There's no crying in baseball. There's no crying in baseball." And so that's one of the famous lines of that movie, which is one of my wife's favorite movies. So that's why there is crying in baseball. There are a lot of stories, and there will be crying in baseball. So at this point, I would love to take questions. I have a lot of answers. I just don't know your questions. So when you give me a question, I'm going to repeat it so that they can get it on the video. So everybody will know the question while I'm going to answer. So don't be shy. Yes?
I've got two questions. The first one is a quote from Barry Savan, the weatherman. Where the hell is Bird Island?
Right. So the first question is a quote from Barry Zavan, the weatherman, and he famously was the weatherman on TV, and he'd always give the weather in Bird Island. Well, the thing about Bird Island is nobody really knows where Bird Island is. So we had bumper stickers and T-shirts that said, "Where the hell is Bird Island?" And even people in Minnesota, when you say, "Where are you from?" Bird Island, and they would go, "Where the hell is that?" So that was his first question. Your second question.
The second question was the first time I met Jimmy Kahmann. He was a great umpire, and he umpired our softball tournament for 2 days. Sunburned his legs so bad he couldn't hardly walk. He did a terrific job. He could have been an umpire.
So his question was, the first time he had met me, I was an umpire. I probably was about 19 or 20 years old, and I did a tournament, and he said my legs got so sunburned I could barely walk on Monday morning. And he goes, "If you would have been an umpire, you would have been a great umpire." So I thank you for that. I really appreciate that. What question?
Has your position that you had changed today?
The question is, has the position that I had as an athletic trainer changed today? And it has. Nowadays, I say there's so many more what we call ancillary people that are involved on the baseball team. When I was in baseball, you had the head athletic trainer, you had the assistant athletic trainer, and you had a strength and conditioning coach. That was it. Now, there's a head trainer, assistant trainer, a second assistant trainer, a massage therapist, an interpreter, a physical therapist, strength guy, an assistant strength guy. So there's like 10 or 11 ancillary people. So the answer is absolutely, the way I learned how to be an athletic trainer has changed dramatically as to what they do now. Your second question.
My question is, when someone is released from the team, like they changed the end, who actually makes that decision?
So the question is, when a player gets released from a team, who makes that decision? And I talk about that in the book a lot. A lot of times it happens in spring training, and they have staff meetings during the course of spring training, and they'll recommend if a guy is good enough to continue or if he's not good enough to release him. The person that actually releases him is the minor league director. And so I always said spring training was the hardest time because teams would bring in 150 players, but there was only 100 jobs. So 50 people were going to be going home in a matter of a month. So 50 young men, dreams were going to end. So if you're a young man and your whole life you've been geared to being a professional baseball player, and you get a tap on the shoulder and says the minor league director wants to talk to you, 10 minutes later you're coming back into the locker room with tears in your eyes and you're packing your bag. So that's why I say there is crying in baseball, and for me as an athletic trainers have a special bond with players because players will tell us stuff that they won't tell the manager, their pitching coach, their wives, girlfriends, parents. We have a very good relationship with the players. So when those players would get released, I would feel it too. So I always said spring training was always the hardest mentally for that type of situation. Okay.
This is a question for you, not so much as an author, but as a trainer. Why is it that some athletes, great shape, with all the things that they can go through in the supplements, seem to be constantly injured with minor injuries? Out for 2 weeks with a lower thigh bruise.
So the question is, why
I'm thinking of Brian Buxton.
Okay. So the question is, are these terrifically in shape athletes getting these injuries that keep them out for extended period of time? It's a very tough question to answer. I personally believe nowadays there's just too many people around. So when a player gets hurt, they have to jump through so many hurdles just to get back on the field. Back in the day when I was the athletic trainer, we had a pretty good system. We'd get the player healthy, he'd get back on the field. Nowadays, money is an issue, agents are an issue, everything is an issue. So everything that you're trying to do time-wise to get a player back gets exaggerated and makes it longer. I know what you're talking about with Mr. Buxton. He always seems to be on the injured reserve list. So
I remember reading that he's been in the majors 10 years and he's only played more than 100 games in a season once.
yeah, so he said he's been in the big leagues 10 years, but he's only played 100 games in one season one time. So, and the other thing too is genetics. You know, some people have very good genetics and can handle, take a look at Cal Ripken. The guy played every day for 14 or 16 years. So he had minor injuries during those things. I was there for one of them. Can't talk about it. But he was a strong athlete. He had a good constitution. Okay? Some of these players have a weak constitution. Okay? So, but genetics plays a lot in that.
Yeah.
Question?
You talk a lot about being employed in the minor leagues, and I don't know anything about you, so were you in the majors also?
So the question is, I've been talking a lot about my time in the minor leagues, and he asked, work in the major leagues also? The short answer is yes. I spent 11 years in the minor leagues and 9 years in the major leagues with the Minnesota Twins. But all the writing in this book was my first 5 years in the minor leagues. I didn't, like I said, I didn't start off to write a book. It just happened. So when I took a break, it was a break. And so all these stories about my life in the minor leagues. Do I have stories about my life in the big leagues? You sure bet I do. Am I gonna write about it?
Yeah.
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer is probably yes, but I just don't know when I'm gonna start that process.
So to follow that up, who was the manager then that you worked for?
In the major leagues was Tom Kelly was my first manager, and then Ron Gardenhire was my second manager. Question over here.
A friend of mine and I were talking one time, full of empties, that the Twins have gone through in the last couple of years. They've got some really good ball players, but they're injured a lot. And he theorized that these kids are bulking up too much muscle mass. Is that, in your opinion, part of the problem?
So the question is, are players having too much muscle mass nowadays because of all the workouts that they do, all the supplements that they take, and it seems like those players are getting hurt and they're staying hurt longer? I can't say medically yes or no to that question, but in my heart, my opinion is yes. I think back in the day, players healed quicker. Some players might not complain about something, but again, the number of contracts and the amount of money these players are playing now, that's always in the back of their head. Their agents are always in the back of their head. Back in the day, agents really weren't a problem until the player's contract was up. But nowadays, their agent calls the general manager and everybody on a daily basis and stuff. So, in my opinion, I think they're bulking up way too much. I mean, if you saw Brad Radke or Greg Maddux walk into this library, you would never say, that guy won 300 games as a pitcher, because he was 5'8" and weighed about 170 pounds. Okay, so nowadays, these pitchers are mammoth people, so. We have to wrap this up. So if there's if one more question, if somebody has it, okay, one more.
When you got the job with the Twins, had you applied for it, or did they contact you?
The big league job?
Yeah.
The question was, did I apply for the job, or did the Twins come talking to me? I was already working in the minor leagues, and as a player, you progress in the minor leagues from one level to the next. So I worked in A-ball, the next step was AA, and then AAA, and then it's the big leagues. So the assistant trainer got let go at the end of the 95 season. So the general manager called me and offered me the job. And the day I got offered the job was the same day that O.J. Simpson got acquitted. So the general manager, the phone rang and I picked it up and it was Terry Ryan, and Terry goes, "What are you doing?" And I go, "Well, I'm sitting here watching the O.J. get acquitted." And then he goes, "Okay." He goes, "Do you want to be the assistant athletic trainer?" And so that's how that started. So I thank you. Really, this has been a pleasure. This whole experience has put a big smile on my face, and I'm really glad that my brother convinced me that I wrote a book. Thank you.